first example of day for night, we will work with an outdoor shot, and specifically an outdoor shot that was not shot for a day for night. The shot, therefore, presents a whole series of problems related to the fact that it has not been filmed to be converted later on, so we have strong highlights on the objects, we have a character with a very bright shirt, and above all, do not have an environment creation, light cuts and shadows that allows us to easily make a night conversion. When we have to make a night image, we need to think about how the night works. At night, we see lower color ranges, we see everything a little more desaturated, we are not able to perceive the long frequencies of light, so we see less colors such as red and green, and for this reason we have a greater presence of cyan and blue. This set of peculiarities must be brought back into the scene. To do this, the very step is to make a very strong cull of highlights. We go to work on the curves and in particular on the whole set of RGB curves, creating a bend in the low lights, but above all, a very pushed shoulder in the highlights. This will lead our whole image to become very washed out, very poor, and as you can see from the curves in the parade, very compressed downwards. Let us move on to the waveform monitor, which helps us better to see how all the elements are compacting towards a very low range of information. The other step to take at the same time, after having knocked down the highlights, is to reduce the gain and the gamma, operating specifically and exclusively on the luminance values. Through the bars, we lower the gain and a little bit the gamma as well, to make the whole image a little darker. In all this, we need to give consistency to the foreground character who still has a bright shirt. Thus, we will need to recreate a situation of light and shadow. In this shot, the best way is to create a pool of light, as if it were an off-stage lamppost or the moonlight, which throws some light on the character, partially justifying the bright shirt, justifying the highlights that will inevitably remain on the rims of the car, and a little also some of the reflections present in the shot. Through the same mask, we will make a further reduction of the highlights that we can see on the rest of the car, and in a later step, we will eliminate the reflections of full daylight that we see on the trees in the background. Let us add a serial node and create a dedicated mask using the curve tool. So we create a power window that will roughly follow the character. We create a kind of lighting space that shapes along the car, selecting the area that must receive light. Obviously, everything must be very soft, so we create an inside softness and an outside softness that we modify further to be suitable for the scene, creating a very defined environment with a very narrow inner area that will follow the character, and on the other hand, an extremely large outer area that will go to take as the pool of light everything that remains out of our focus. We extend and soften this component very much. We also take the second leg, which remains a little more shaded, and the rest of the car, meaning the back of it. Inside this area, we will carry out a further abatement of light and make a very slight change towards the cold, initially working on the highlights. Then we slightly bring the highlights to the cold and then apply a further reduction of the gain and the gamma. It must still be a dark environment. We then proceed by inserting an additional serial node that connects the matte to have the outside mask. And on the external image, we make a much more massive intervention, operating this time on the entire curve, going to significantly lower the gain and the gamma. We must try to strike a balance between the two elements while also trying to cool the rest of the environment. It can be a good practice at this stage to go and do an extra highlight capping, dampening the lights in the background even more. As a final touch, we can reduce the saturation even quite strongly because, as mentioned, we perceive less colors at night. So we greatly reduce the saturation of background elements. Obviously, it is a continuous recalibrate and readjust and retweak these elements until we create complete coherence and fusion between the two parts of the shot. Nothing prevents us, if necessary, from even going to retouch the power window so that some components of the scene do not tend to emerge like the car's headlight here. If we want, we can go down further in terms of gamma and gain in the outside, going to make it much darker. Anyway, we still have some serious issues with the character, who stands out a lot, especially because of the unfortunate choice of clothing. So we need to intervene further on him and obviously further on the background. The next step in this case will be an intervention on the background where we will generate a dedicated power window to cut out the back of the car in a soft way. We obviously must fix the curves to be smooth and once again we define a softness value both inside and outside. In this node, we will sensitively compress the blacks with a lift intervention, but not too exaggerated, so as not to completely lose some texture of the background. Of course, we must avoid having such neat elements, so let us go back to the power window and further soften these areas, even possibly adding points and consequently softening the selection, so that we do not see too clear passages between one element and the other, especially in this part where we have no element that stands out from the background. It is a work of constant balance, so let us go back to the outside matte and darken it further. We also intervene on the force power window, tightening some components to make everything as uniform as possible. As already mentioned, the last step is the unfortunate short of the protagonist. So we add a serial node and perform a validation isolating as much as possible the specific component. Try not to take other parts of the scene, because the intervention we are going to do is a massive white capping. We make it by lowering the white values until we border on chromatic aberrations in the short, and then immediately move them up a bit, significantly reducing the presence of the short. We can also slightly reduce the saturation here, but just a little, and possibly slightly lower the gamma. This scene that started from this situation now looks much more like a nocturnal environment. A final touch could be, with one last serial node, to give the whole scene, depending on the mood of the situation, a slightly colder tone. Be careful, however, not to overdo when cooling a night shot. Playing it, we immediately notice one thing. We worked on a single frame, but unfortunately the shot is moving. So as soon as the camera moves, we see the correction area that remains static. This is not a big deal. DaVinci's tracking system is very performing, so we go to the different power windows, select them, and simply track the scene. Let us start with the first power window, move on to the second power window. It is not necessary, of course, on validation and secondary correction. At this point, we can finally watch the scene with the character that remains slightly illuminated by a semi-ambient light.